Mr. Pond Boss, tell me what to do to make all my Lunker Lake dreams come true.
Hello everybody, Bob Lusk broadcasting live on this Thanksgiving evening. Actually, Thanksgiving Eve evening. Coming to you live from Pond Boss World Headquarters outside of beautiful Gordonville, Texas. Looks like we got Jason Nepstad checking in, Dick Tabbert, John Wilson checking in. Hey John, had a blast hanging out with David last week, or I guess a week before. Had a ball hanging out with those guys. Hey, tonight, thought I'd talk about trying to make decisions about resetting or restarting a pond. Craig McBride checking in. Good to see you, guy. So, I thought tonight we just try to tackle that topic. When do you start a new pond? Or when do you restart an old pond? Or what does it mean to start over? So let's tackle that. But before we do that, you guys know the drill. Click like on this broadcast. And I'm trying to find it here so I can look at it with you. Click like, share it to your timeline, and hashtag Pond Boss Magazine in the comment section. You'll be eligible for a drawing for a Pond Boss cap and a Pond Boss mug. Now, we're a little behind on the drawings. I'm going to talk to Leanne about that. It's the day before Thanksgiving, and they scooted out of the office pretty early so they could go home and get the turkey ready to cook today. So anyway, you guys know the drill. If you'll do that, I'll appreciate it. And let's see here. Holy cow, I can already see the questions. That's pretty dang cool. Wow. All right. Bear with me a minute, guys, so I can do what I need to do so I can see these questions as they come across. All right. All aquatics. Holy cow, look at there. John Funk, John Micklick, John Wilson. Awesome. Yeah, it was awesome, man. I tell you, we had a blast. We got to figure out how to make that lake better, but it was really fun. Tori Rhodes. Hi, Tori. So here's what I'm thinking to talk about tonight is how in the world do you know if you should start a pond over or if you should fix it? And I'll tell you, early on in my fisheries management career, part of my thinking was if it wasn't like we wanted it or there were some fish that we really didn't want, start over. Well, I don't necessarily think that is the right thing to do all the time. John Funk, hi there from a very cold mid-Michigan. You got 3/4 of an inch on the pond already. That's pretty early for you guys, isn't it, John? I mean, typically you have ice around the first or second week of December, isn't that right? Barry Mounts checking in. Good to see you. So, let's see here. I'm going to make sure I can follow these questions as they come along. Yep, okay, I got them. So, I'm going to tell you a few stories about how to make decisions about starting a pond over. As a matter of fact, we just did one. I'll tell you that story first. We had the pleasure of analyzing a lake in northwestern or north central Mississippi, not far from Ashland, Mississippi. And this lake's about 25 acres. It's a good sized body of water. And the guys there, they said, our goals are pretty clear. We've already got a pond or a lake that we can fish and catch a lot of fish. So there's like this old flood prevention lake on that piece of property that covers probably 50 or 60 acres. So if they just want to go catch a bunch of dinks, 10 to 14 inches with an occasional 4 or 5 pounder, they have a pond for that. They got another pond that they want to manage for big sunfish. But they want to take this 26, 25 acre lake right next to their house, the lodge, I guess you could call it. It's a house. They'd like to grow some, sure enough, really, really big bass. Well, we figured out the bass they have are overcrowded. They were about, 8 to 14 inches long. 14 inches was a big one, and the average age was about 6 years old. So even if we thinned out the numbers of those bass, ramped up the food chain, made the water more productive, they'd end up with a whole bunch of bass that would top out maybe at around 5 to 7 pounds. That isn't really what they wanted. Hi, Chris Chavetta. Hope you guys are staying warm up there in Missouri. Leanne checking in. Hey, Leanne. Tom Davis, hashtag Pond Boss Magazine. You know what to do. And be sure and share this video on your timeline so we can keep building an audience. So anyway, what we decided to do with this lake was start it over. And here's why. not only were those fish old, comparatively speaking, you know, a largemouth bass of unknown genetics can live to be 7 to 14 years old. Northern strain fish live to be 6 to 8 years old, where Florida strain bass can live to be, I don't know, 13, 14, 15. Now that varies based on geography. Chicago, Illinois, it's a little bit different. They'll live longer there because it's colder longer there. There's Kyle Edwards, Tom Davis, Fred Bingaman checking in. So what we decided to do was, and we did this back in June to start talking about it, what we asked them to do, it's a fishing club, and what we asked them to do is drain the water down about 5 or 6 feet, because we figured out that for every foot of water they could take off that lake, that would save them $3,500 worth of Rotenone cost. So if they could take off 4 feet of water or 5 feet of water, then shoot, it would cost them a lot less money to Rotenone that lake. Now, here's the thing, I'm going to tell you a couple things about Rotenone. First of all, it's a restricted use pesticide. So you can't buy that unless you have a pesticide license. Now you can, if you have a private applicator's license, you can buy it, or if you have a commercial applicator's license, you can buy it. Here's another little tip, that stuff's kind of in short supply. Well, these guys figured out how to siphon water off the lake, and they got it down about 4 or 5 feet, and we were hoping to get it down maybe even 7 feet to draw it down into about 10 acres of shallow water, bring our electrofishing boats and see if we could collect some, if there were any big bass, we could take the big bass, save those, move them to the other lake, and any big sunfish that we could harvest and save, we could move those to that big lake as well. Because our goal was to Rotenone, to have a 3-acre pond adjacent to this 25 or 26 acre lake. Well, as fate has it, for you guys that have been watching the weather, every time they'd get that lake down 5 or 6 feet, it would rain and fill it up 2 or 3 feet. That happened over and over and over. So finally, they said, you know what? It's getting to the point where, because they could siphon it down so far, then they had to pump it. So it got to the point where they decided they didn't want to spend any more money on pumping. They decided to go ahead and spend the money on the Rotenone and get it knocked out. So we did that 2 weekends ago on a Sunday, and we spent all day long just applying Rotenone. We bought liquid Rotenone. We bought 180 gallons of it, 6 30-gallon barrels, and we put it in the boats. We had 2 boats out there. We shared this with another company that is a friend of ours, and we started pumping the Rotenone to it. And actually, well, I'll tell you it was American Sport Fish Hatchery. We had them drive over, bring a boat and a crew. We brought one of our boats and our crew, and we started Rotenone in that lake. And I mean, within 20 or 30 minutes, we had fish floating up. Now, the water was 26 feet deep in some parts of that lake. So what we did was, Kelly Duffy with Helena is where we bought our Rotenone. Kelly sent a device that he built that meters the volume of Rotenone, lets us apply it at a rate we want, and we can pump it to the bottom of the lake. So what my crews and I did, we started off with a depth finder, and we started plotting our course. And so we could track where we were, and we applied Rotenone in the bottom 3 feet of the water, then we raised it, and then we applied it in the next 3 feet of the water. And as we did that, we started making a wider swath. So we knew how much Rotenone we wanted to put out in a given area, and it worked great. Shoot, by the end of the day, and here's something else. The water temperature was 56 degrees that day, which is pretty cold. So the fish were sluggish, and they didn't come up fast, you know, like they would in the summertime. But we were seeing a lot of dead fish quick. And there's Jason Nepstack. Got to spend some good time with Jason a couple of weeks ago over in North Carolina at McFadden Lake where he lives. That was pretty fun too. So anyway, it'll probably take 3 to 4 weeks for the Rotenone to dissipate to the point that we can restock that lake, and they'd like to go ahead and get the forage fish going. So we're talking about that right now. So their decision was, we've got a bunch of small bass that are old, and it would probably take 2 years to thin their numbers down to the point that the remaining fish would begin to grow as we could rebuild a food chain. Well, what they decided to do is go ahead and write a pretty big check, because Rotenone's expensive, and take out the fish and just start over from scratch. And they're going to save 3 years on fish growth and have a greater high-end potential for bigger bass within about 5 years. So it was a decision that they decided to make. So now, how do you make that decision? Should you rotenone? Should you take your fish out? Should you drain the pond? Well, here's the way I look at that. Start off with some really distinct goals. If you know what you want, then you got to figure out the best game plan to get you from where you are to where you want to be. What that means next is you got to know where you are to figure out how to get where you want to be. Robert Dyer, finally get to see it live. Yes, sir. When play fish kill occurs due to low dissolved oxygen, which species would die first? Largemouth bass, bluegill, or catfish? If you've got an oxygen depletion and fish are dying from that, typically the first fish to die are shad, because they have a little higher metabolism rate and they have they require more oxygen than the other fish. The second thing is, when on your question, the bigger fish die first, whether it's largemouth bass, bluegill, or catfish. It seems as though when fish get a few years on them, their oxygen demand is higher. So a big bass has a higher oxygen demand than a little bitty bass. So you're going to end up seeing your bigger fish die first. I've seen a number of fish kills that weren't 100%, where the little bitty fish, a bunch of little bitty fish stayed behind and restocked the lake. There's Billy Birch. Hey, Billy Birch, checking in from Southeast Texas. Debbie Neely and Paul Picard. Dick Tabbert. Hashtag Pond Boss Magazine. That's it. Share this to your timeline. Click like. So, here's another situation. I looked at a 3-acre pond. Oh, God, this was a long time ago, probably 25 years ago. That was just loaded with green sunfish about that big. Now, what had happened in that lake, it had had a fish kill a couple of years earlier and killed all the bass, all the bluegill that were in it, but the green sunfish made it because they have a little lower affinity for oxygen than some of the other fish do. Well, what they did was, after the fish kill occurred, the lake rebounded, but it rebounded with a whole bunch of green sunfish. And so what happened there is, over about a 2-year period, there were 6 or 7 different size classes of green sunfish. Well, what caused the fish kill in the first place was this pond sits in the immediate downstream watershed of a turkey farm. Well, the turkey farm had closed, and the landowner decided that he wanted to, hey, Kelly Williams, how you doing, neighbor? Good to see you. Billy Bates joined up. Bob Wusher checking in, our Purina friend and family friend. And so what we decided to do there was, we could spend the money on Rotenone to take out the green sunfish from this 3-acre pond. The point source for the pollution, the waste coming off of a turkey farm, was gone. The turkey farm had been eliminated. So our choice was, we could Rotenone and kill all those green sunfish, or come up with another plan. Well, it was going to cost about $3,500 to Rotenone that pond, and we were able to buy some 12 to 14-inch bass whose mouths were big enough to eat those green sunfish. So in that case, instead of starting the pond over, we went and bought some fairly young 10 to 14-inch bass, stocked them in there with some adult bluegills. And the theory there was that the bass would chow down on the green sunfish, wipe their numbers down, the bluegill would start to reproduce, and bluegill in that part of Texas reproduce 5 times a year. The green sunfish reproduce once. So my thought process there that I hoped would work, and that the landowner bought into, was that if we stocked those advanced bass that were about 1.5 years old, that they would feed on the green sunfish, grow fast, the bluegill would outcompete the green sunfish for spawning areas and reproduce a bunch. And that worked. It worked. Within about 3 years, they had some 6 to 7 pound bass. The green sunfish numbers had plummeted. Bluegill numbers were going up. And we had a thing that was working pretty good. By the way, we stocked, I think it was 20 largemouth bass per acre. So we only put 60 bass in there. And the next year, the bass spawned. They got ahead of the green sunfish within about 18 months, and that deal worked. Worked real good. Billy Bates, hey, Bob, love following along to get the education. Hey, Billy Bates, I kind of lurk on your Facebook page, and you made me chuckle the other day on something. Can't remember what it was, but it was really funny. I liked it. I thought about stealing it. So I'm glad you're here too. I appreciate you joining in. So let's talk about how you decide whether or not you should start your pond over. Well, here's the, hey, Brian Mahaffey, Cisco checking in from the Pond Boss discussion forum. Good to see you there, Brian. Here's how to decide if you should start your pond over. You know, when you take a cucumber and you put it, yeah, the dog digging the rabbit, that was hilarious. I laughed at that, man. That was hilarious. If it would take too long for your pond to recover and become like you want, that's when you should decide whether or not you should start it over. Hey, thanks, Billy. Appreciate the compliment. Billy Birch, doing an awesome job. For example, like the pond we're talking about in Mississippi, it would have taken at least 3 years to get that pond, which is a 25 acre lake. It would take at least 3 years to unpickle that pickle, because once that cucumber goes in the vinegar, it ain't going to be a cucumber anymore. So trying to unpickle a fisheries pickle often is not easy to do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to start over. I'll take another example. Here's a lake. Good gosh, this happened this you'll like this story. Lake Kiowa, almost 600 acres south of us. Started working on that lake off and on in 1986 and worked on it until about 1998 or so and switched gears. There's Tim Jackson checking in from North Carolina. John Krause checking in from Illinois. Good to see you guys. So what happened up at Lake Kiowa was over a period of 3 or 4 years, that lake pretty much got choked up with coontail vegetation. I mapped it in 1992, and my gosh, it was about 60% covered with coontail. Well, people couldn't launch their boats. It's a homeowners association lake with a bunch of, I think there's like 1,500 homes around it today, and people couldn't use the lake. So as we were devising a game plan to deal with the coontail, which ended up being grass carp, triploid grass carp. Happy Thanksgiving to you, Tim Jackson. What we started to do is study the fishery. Well, I hadn't looked at that lake probably in 4 years at that point. And so what we figured out was they had a whole bunch of bass that weren't growing at nearly the rate they should, because all the forage fish were living in the coontail. So when you got a pond or lake that's covered 60% in real dense aquatic plants, those aquatic plants are going to be teeming with bait fish, but the game fish can't get to them. So our game plan there was to see if we could begin to diminish the volume of coontail, the aquatic plants, and then make more bait fish available to be eaten by the remaining bass. And what we thought would happen was we had a whole bunch of bass like that were 3 and 4 years old, and we knew their growth potential wasn't going to be very, very good. But we also knew it wasn't going to be practical to try to harvest a bunch of those fish and take them out and make room for more. So what happened there was, as the coontail went away, the young of the year fish that were spawned the next year outgrew the remaining fish 10 to 1. So we had a whole new year class of bass come in and just have growth curve like that. So the young bass really started to thrive and get big quick. And they outgrew their older siblings and cousins and nephews and nieces and stuff. There's Renee Pullen Huddle. Renee Huddle checking in. Hi, Renee. Good friend of ours. Kevin Briggs. Good to see you, Kevin. Happy Thanksgiving to you, too. So in that case, by eliminating the vegetation and freeing up the bait fish, that allowed younger bass to grow faster, catch up, and surpass the existing fish. Thanks for the like, Carrie Cooper Wood. Appreciate it. Jennifer Royce checking in. So let's circle back to your pond. How do you know whether you should start over or not? Well, if you know how you want it to be and you can figure out where you are, then you got to come up with a game plan as to how to get from where you are to where you want to be. And then there's the timeline. So let's say you got a pond like most people. Danny Tolliver checking in. Says hi. Hi, Danny. Good to see you. Jennifer Royce, hashtag Pond Boss Magazine. You know the drill. Good job. So once you can figure, as long as you know where you are, here's the questions you got to answer. And I'm just going to talk about the fish for right now. Just for the fish. If your goal is to take your existing bass and make them grow better, then you got to do two things. You got to rebuild their food chain. It takes 10 pounds of bait fish to gain a pound if you're a game fish. You guys know that if you've watched this show more than once. The second thing is you got to have the food chain to support them. If you've got too many mouths with too little food, you're going to see your bass growth rates drop and then or level off and then begin to decline. If you want to change that, then you got to change the dynamics and change the ratios of your fish, which means you got to harvest some bass and then do the things you need to do to beef up and grow more bait fish. Now, if you can do those two things, then your pond can recover. But if you start looking at it and you say, you know, it's been like this 5 or 6 years, you might be a good candidate to renovate. Now, there's a lot of ways to do it. You know, Rotenone is one way. That's probably the most typical, classical way to do it. However, I've also used anhydrous ammonia. Now, you got to be careful. In some places, it's not legal to do that. Well, where we are, we could use it. Actually, the first time I used it was with a fisheries extension specialist way back in the 80s. And it did a great job. Hey, Matt Willis, good to see you, buddy. And so you got to decide the best way to do that. Another way is to draw some water off. You know, if you can draw some water off, I've had guys tell me, I don't know if I would do this or not, but I've had several guys tell me that they'll use swimming pool chlorine to take their fish out. You know, I don't know, because I don't like the residual effects of chlorine in water. You know, that may be a good way to do it. I know some fish hatcheries do that sometimes. You know, another thing to do is like this time of year, you can draw the water down as long as you're in an area where the pond will recover in the spring with spring rains. You can draw the water down and then confine the fish. If you can confine the fish, what'll happen is you'll take, say, 3 acres worth of fish in a pond and draw it down to ½ an acre. You take 3 acres worth of fish, put them in ½ an acre, they're going to eat each other. So the big fish will eat the smaller fish. That can change the dynamics. And then not restart it. Now, here's a tip. I make the pond force me to restart it. So in other words, the way I look at it is can we manage it differently to fix it and get it restarted? But if the pond says, nope, the fish are too old, they've been like this for too long, and it would be much, much more efficient to start over, that's when I say, okay, let's do that. Now, I might give a little different advice to a guy that's 26 compared to a guy that's 76. You know, because time is of the essence in a lot of cases. You know, so how do you decide? Well, you got to figure out where your pond is and what would it take to fix it. You know, and how much money do you want to spend? That's also a key. Here's Jacob West. Hey, Jacob, good to see you, buddy. We're talking about if you should restart a pond or not. You don't have to worry about that. You got a brand new one that's going to be full of water again one of these days after you finish it. So now, here's some other things to think about. If you draw the water down, then you're going to have an opportunity to fix the habitat. Because remember, here's our 4 key principles in fisheries management, pond management. Habitat, that's the #1 thing. Odds are high that your pond got like it is because of the habitat that it has. All right? Or the habitat that it's lacking. So habitat is a big deal. And I've already done several shows on that. You guys can go back and look at those and find articles that we've published about that. The second thing is the food chain. So if you got the right kind of habitat and you got the right food chain, things are going to work. But what happens is when you stock the food chain, the forage fish, bluegill, red ear, minnows, whatever, and it gets here, and then pretty soon you got your bass coming in here. After about 18 months, it's like this. A couple of years is like that. And by about year 3, when the bass begin to reproduce, you'll see a decline in the food as these bass grow. And then so in other words, they're to the point where they're overeating the food chain. So if you're not doing the things to support the food chain, then you're going to end up with a whole bunch of bass that are starting to go hungry, especially when these things start to reproduce. And what will happen is it'll get like this, then this will drop, then this will drop. So what you'll see from the boat is that your bass are going to start losing weight, especially in a specific size class. You'll start seeing bass, say in the 12 to 14 inch size range or the 10 to 13 inch size range begin to decline in weight. So when you see that, then you got to be harvesting fish. All right? But where we typically see ponds and lakes that people want to start over, they just bought the property or they haven't managed a pond in a long, long time. And so they decide that, hey, you know, it's time to, let's just start over. You know, used to, you could go into the feed store and buy a bag of powdered Rotenone and use it and then go get more fish. You know, back in the 70s and 80s, it was common for people to do that. Just go buy a bag of Rotenone. You could buy it over the counter, you know, but you can't do that now. So, and Rotenone comes in powder form, and it also comes in a liquid. Now, one thing, while I'm on the subject of Rotenone that I want to tell you about is that Rotenone, when you apply it, you got to get it mixed into the water column, top to bottom. Now, this time of year, there is no thermocline. That's why we were pumping Rotenone down 26 feet deep. We checked oxygen levels and temperature of the water 26 feet deep at the bottom. Oxygen levels were like 90% of saturation at 6.5 parts per million. It was pretty amazing. And the temperature was also 56 at the bottom like it was on the top. Betty Patterson, I'm here. Hi, Betty. Well, I'm here. Good to see you. Tim Jackson, has anyone ever had fish as part of their Thanksgiving dinner? I have. Hey, man, when I first got into the fisheries business, it was kind of hard to scratch out enough of a living to really, I mean, we always figured out how to do Thanksgiving, but I'm going to give you one little tip about fish, catfish especially, because that's what I eat. I've had catfish every way you can cook it. It's not so good in enchiladas. I just got to share that with you. Tony and Lowell Bennett starting to build upon. Well, you've come to the right place. We're happy to help you with that. If you guys want to send me an email at boblusk@outlook.com, I will correspond with you on the side about what things you need to think about building a pond. Back to applying Rotenone. Billy Bates, bake striped bass every year here on the Chesapeake for Thanksgiving. I love that idea. Now, when you bake your striped bass, I'll tell you one thing we did when I was in upstate New York one Thanksgiving. We took some striped bass and we rolled it kind of in a roll and we stuffed it with stuffing. And it was kind of a seafood stuffing. And we added capers and all kinds of good stuff. It was really, really good. So applying Rotenone. Rotenone emulsifies into water. Remember that. So if you use the powdered variety and you want to get it on the bottom, what we would do with Rotenone, powdered Rotenone, is we would make it into softballs and pitch it out so it could sink down into the bottom of the pond and flush those fish out of the bottom. With the liquid Rotenone, we're pumping it into the lake, mixing it from the bottom up. And that's how we did that. And the fish, we had a boat at one end of the lake and a boat at the other end of the lake, and we worked toward the middle. By the time we got to the middle a couple of weeks ago, we saw more and more and more fish because they were trying to run away from it. And they met in the middle, and then that's where they met their demise. So applying Rotenone, you really need to study that before you do it so you'll know how to do it right. In the summertime, applying Rotenone, the fish are going to be above the thermocline. You know, so we could have gotten away with using less Rotenone in the summer than we did this time of year, but, you know, it's what we had to deal with. Chad Donaldson says, what is that? What is what? I'm not sure what you're asking. What is Rotenone? If you're asking what Rotenone is a fish toxicant. It's called a pesticide. It's a derivative of the Daris root, which is a plant native to Colombia. And the price has gone up. I guess that's because there's a better cash crop in Colombia than Rotenone is. Okay. Chad, I'm not sure what you're asking me. Sorry. Rotenone does have an oily sheen, but that's why you mix it into the water, because you got to get it emulsified into the water as best you can. A lot of times we'll apply it in a small pond and run a boat motor around and around and around and mix it up really, really well. Okay, so now going back. Good gosh, Chad, I'm not sure what you're asking me. What's the orange goop? Has an oily sheen. I don't know what you're asking. Be a little more explicit. What's the orange goop? I don't know. I have no idea what you're talking about. Okay, so some ponds, it would be a wise idea just to drain it. Actually, I'll tell you what. Here's another true story. I was talking to a guy from Houston who's bought some land near Navasota, Texas. Now, I communicated with him on the phone a couple times and by email 2 or 3 times. I've even got a story about him in the November-December issue of Pond Boss Magazine. So, if you want to know about it, if you want to follow this story that I'm getting ready to tell you, there's a pretty big article about that in this issue of the magazine. So he called me and he said, his question was, I've got a lot of plants. How do I get rid of the plants without using herbicides? I want to be able to just cut them or do something to get rid of all these aquatic plants. So I found this place on Google Earth and I started looking at it. And my gosh, that lake it might have an average depth of 3 feet. A lot of shallow water. I went back all the way to 1993 and found that lake and went through the progression of the satellite images. And there were years where the lake was drawn down into the borrow pit. There were times when the lake was muddy. There was times when the lake had no plants in it. And there were times when the lake was choked with plants. Susie Nugent. Thanks, Susie and Bruce. Rick Perkins checking in. Hey, Rick. And so what my advice to him was to drain the lake. His question to me was, what do I do with the fish? I'd like to save the fish. Well, when there's a pond that, and I'll describe that pond, the borrow pit of this pond, and it's about 15 acres. The borrow pit's probably 2 acres. That's where they took the dirt to build the dam way back when, probably in the 70s. I couldn't go back far enough on Google Earth and find that out because the satellite imagery didn't exist. And so my advice to him was to drain the lake, let it sit for 18 months to 2 years, and then come back in with heavy equipment and rearrange a bunch of the dirt inside the lake. Now, he loves it because it's pristine and it's mature, a lot of great trees around the perimeter of the lake. So he didn't really want to disturb the soil. So what I suggested was drain the lake, get all the water out, kill all the fish. The fish in a case like that are irrelevant. They're easy to replace. This lake doesn't have the right habitat, so it can't possibly have a good fishery. So what I told him was the fish value was pretty much zero. But what the value would be to take the water off the lake, drain it down low, let the silt drain down as much as it could, then get in there and rearrange dirt. If he could rearrange the dirt and build some peninsulas, build some islands, and try to figure out how to get more depth. The depth meaning you want to have a 3-to-1 slope on your way down at least 3 feet deep. And in areas where the water fluctuates, like where he is, need to get down to 5 or 6 feet deep, and then you can level off the bottom. So that was my advice to him. And once I sent him that advice, haven't heard back from him. So I don't know what he's going to do, but that's what I would do there. Okay, Chad, we're going to try you one more time. My new pond dam has an orange slime bleeding out of the base of the pond dam. Do you think it's algae? No. I think if it's an orange slime, chances are there's some iron ore in the soil and there's water seeping through that. And if the dam wasn't made out of at least 30% compactable clay, then chances are that you've got some seepage. And what happens when water seeps through iron or rock, the water turns orange. So I probably do think you're asking me, is it iron from the earth? That would be my best guess. I would get the guy that built the pond out there to take a look at it. Hey, Jeremy Duckworth, good to see you. So other scenarios on where you should restart a pond is when one's got a lot of years on it. Now, here's a decision that you need to make. Now, if you've got, the answer I'm going to give you here is based on where the pond is. For example, I got a call from a homeowners association in Birmingham, Alabama, not long ago. And they got a 3-acre pond right in the middle of their property. And they said, well, we want to start this pond over. Well, their best bet would be to dredge it. I called some friends of mine who went and looked at it. They said they needed to dredge it out. So they could do that, dredge it, let the water go back in the pond, get the soil out, get the depth they needed, and then work on the fish. You know, so I've seen a bunch of ponds. Here's a classic case. This happens fairly often where my phone will ring. The latest one was this. This guy called me and says, "Hi, I'm so excited. I got to buy my grandfather's farm, and he built a pond on it in the 40s. And then after he passed away, the farm was sold, and it's just been lying fallow for a long, long time. And I had the chance to buy it, so I bought it. And there's a 3-acre pond where I grew up catching bass and catfish. And now it's got cattails all the way around it, and I'd really like to figure out if I could do something to make it better. So how do I kill the cattails?" That was his question to me. So I said, I looked at it on Google Earth, and man, the cattails were growing out 40 feet all the way around this 3-acre pond, probably cut its size by 30 or 40%. You're welcome, Chad. And so as I looked at it, and you could see the cattails on Google Earth, it was pretty clear. What I told him that he should look at is what it would take to excavate the cattails, because over a long period of time, that pond had silted in and was shrinking. It was going through its natural process of dying. Because what happens, you build a pond, over time it silts in, and as the silt comes in, plants grow. And in this case, it was cattails. And those cattails were 6 or 7 feet tall, he said. He said he couldn't get through them. And he tried to go through once, and there was a cottonmouth, and he sunk up to his mid-thigh in silt, decided that wasn't a good thing to do. So he didn't. So the question he had for me was how do I kill the cattails? Well, you can spray them. So then you got a bunch of dead cattails sitting in silty water, and it's really shallow, that you still can't access. So, Ashi Saluki, hi, not sure where you're from, but glad you're aboard. So what I suggested to him was drain the pond, get some heavy equipment in, excavate the cattails, look at that. But before you do it, get some bids on it. So he started looking at it, and to move the amount of dirt he wanted to move to bring that pond back to life was going to be about $40,000 to $60,000. He didn't want to spend that much money, and I don't blame him. So he said, "Is there another way?" So I said, "Yep, let's take a look at this. What if you raise the dam about 3 feet, and then you have an excavator to come around the perimeter, excavate the cattails, swing around, pile them up behind, get a dozer to push them out of the way, and then excavate dirt around the perimeter to raise the dam 3 feet. That way, if you could go down 3 feet, come up 3 feet, you'd have 6 feet of water." So he got bids on that, and it was about $22,000 to $28,000, which was better. And so then as I was looking at the map, I said, or you got another choice. You could go immediately upstream of this pond in the same creek and build a brand new pond. So he got bids on that, and that was $15,000 to $18,000 to build a brand new 2-acre pond. So his choice was to go ahead and build a brand new pond, leave the old one as it was, save some money up, and then renovate the old pond. That way he was able to get what he wanted. And that worked out pretty good for him. Hey, Daniel Powell, good to see you. So my point there is, on restarting a pond that way, do your homework. Figure out what needs to be done to get it like you want it. And then look at the prices and what it would cost to do that. And then figure out what you want to do. And in his case, he decided to build a brand new pond, save up some money, and then come back in later and renovate the old pond. And which is what he did, actually. It took about 5 years for him to do it, but he did it. Which that worked out really good. Hey, Jeremy, thanks, buddy. Happy Thanksgiving to you, too. So there's a few tips on restarting a pond. Now, how do you get the information on whether or not you should kill your fish? Okay, here's a classic example. Let's just take Jason Nepstad, since Jason's watching. Jason lives on about a 125-acre lake in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And we took our electrofishing boat over there and met up with him. And the most dominant species of fish in that lake are common carp, mirror carp, Japanese koi, and hybrids of all those fish. So there's probably, I'm going to bet you, in that lake there's somewhere between 150 and 250 pounds of carp per acre. A lot of carp, and they're disrupting the lake. Well, and there's a lot of shallow, silted in water. Hey, Mike Augustine, good to see you. So as we started talking about it, it's not practical or productive to go in and try to Rotenone a 125-acre lake. You'd be looking at spending 6 figures. But what he can do is he can start figuring out how to harvest carp, get the bass numbers up, where the bass can start feeding on baby carp, which the good news there, they're almost all the carp are huge. We didn't shock up any baby carp, which is interesting, which means they had 1 or 2 years back to back where the carp successfully spawned. So in that case, it makes sense to try to go harvest the carp. But let's say you got a 2-acre pond or a 3-acre pond, and you got carp, and you got gar, and you got gizzard, shad, things like that. You can sure Rotenone that lake and start over, which would be a smart thing to do. But where'd those fish come from? If you haven't eliminated the source, chances are you're going to get it again. So we did that with a lake down in Laredo, Texas a long, long time ago. What was happening is this lake was about 30 acres, 40 when it was full, down in the borrow pit, 10 acres during a drought, which in Laredo, if you're not in a drought, you will be. And the drought ends with a tropical storm, maybe 3 years later, 4 years later. So what we did there was we waited until the lake drew down, and we went in and Rotenoned it, killed every fish in it. And most of the bass were stunted. The water was muddy. We killed the carp, gar, everything that was in it. Well, what happened, the way the carp got in there, was every time that lake filled and overflowed, it was only about 4 miles to the Rio Grande River, and the carp would swim up from the river. So in order to change that, we changed their spillway. We changed the spillway where the carp couldn't swim up. We had them go in and excavate at least, I think we were an elevation of 3 feet lower. So we excavated down 6 feet, smoothed out the spillway, so when the water, and we covered it with rock, a lot of rock in that part of the country. So we covered the spillway with rock and created kind of a waterfall. So the water would flow out, flow down, spread out, then fall over a waterfall, then flow into the Rio Grande River. So, and sure enough, what happened after we Rotenone that lake and it filled back up, when the thing fell down, man, there was a whole lot more carp that were caught right in front of that waterfall. They couldn't swim up the lake. So that worked really, really well. So with those trash fish, it was a smart idea to go ahead and Rotenone that lake and start over. Daniel Powell, sounds like Jason needs to start bow fishing. Yes, it does. Maybe you run over there and help him. You're not that far from him. Talk to Jason. He'll tell you all about it. Won't you, Jason? I know you're watching. And so the reason to restart a fishery is if you have fish that you don't want or fish that are old, that's a good reason to start over. Jason, we got our hopes on traps. You know what? Traps would work real well on that lake, especially once you get them used to eating fish food. So like, for example, in Jason's lake, instead of trying to reset the lake, all they got to do, if they could take that lake and harvest, this sounds like a huge number, and it is. If you could harvest 500 to 700 carp over a span of time, that would impact your fishery significantly. 500 to 700 carp. If you can get that many carp, you're going to start knocking a dent in them. And I promise you this, once you figure out how to do it, your success rate will go up. Now, even when you're trapping, what you'll see is you'll see a law of diminishing returns. There'll be a point where it comes up where you're catching lots, catching some, catching more, catching more, catching more, catching fewer, fewer, fewer. That's a good sign. Hey, Dave Davidson, good to see you, man. Let's see, Zach Russell, hear that, Jason? Yeah, Zach was in the boat with us the other day. Better get that bow going. Yeah, Zach, I could see Zach bow fishing. So the way to decide that if you want to restart is if you've got ratios way out of whack, fish that you want, the species you desire are old, or if you've got way too many fish that are trash fish or fish that you don't want, and it would be really hard to start over. Take a long time. Hard meaning if you can't correct it with management within 3 years, you need to look at changing the lake and go ahead and resetting the lake or restarting the lake. That would be a good thing to do. So there's a few tips on restarting a pond. It's 7:15. We got 15 minutes. If you guys have any questions, hit me with them. You know, I'll tell you something that's been on my mind is, and this has happened nationwide, we went from summer to 4 days of fall, then pretty much into winter. You know, I'm hearing that ice is on ponds earlier than normal. Our water temperatures went from, in early October, we were in the 80s. And then in mid-October, we were in the 70s, like 74, 75. And then our water temperature dropped 20 degrees in about 10 days to 2 weeks. It was crazy. And that's way, way, way too fast. And that's stressful. That's stressful on your fishery. Yep, Jason says, I wish we could drain the lake, save the good fish, and let the trash fish go through the gate. Well, if you can teach those bass to not be there, you could. Except the problem is they would all congregate right there and clog up the drain. So one of the things I'd be looking for is our fish pretty much have stopped feeding, which is not normal. Usually Thanksgiving, we've still got fish coming to feed. So, you know, I don't know what winter's going to be like. I don't know if anybody else knows what winter's going to be like, but I know we got a head start on it. So there's a few tips on starting over. If you have a question, I'm going to stick around for a couple more minutes and hit me with it. If not, I'm going to start wrapping things up. Remember, Pond Boss Magazine, the new one is out, by the way, and here's what it looks like. Beautiful cover. Got some really good articles in it. Let me kind of go through some of them here. Oh, here's a cool thing. You guys will like $35 a year, guys. You've heard me. You've heard my little spiel. You know, I take Debbie to dinner on some Friday nights. I'll spend $40. That's gone the next day. $35 lasts a year, a whole year. So, in this issue of the magazine, one of the articles is let's see, the 5 biggest things. I was at a Pond Boss get-together in Kansas a few weeks ago, and one of the guys there says, hey, Bob, what are the 5 most important things about pond management? If you had to pick the top 5, what are they? Well, I wrote about them in this issue. We've got an article about how to use water level, just like one of the things I talked about. Invasive plants. How do you pick the right predator fish in northern ponds? Here's a great article about a guy trying to decide whether or not he should build a pond. Okay, Zach says, do carp spawn in the main body of the lakes, or do they move upstream like sunfish? No, they'll spawn in the main body of the lake. But what they'll do is they'll eject their eggs in cattails typically, or up in the shallow water, and you'll see them. You'll see their backs coming out of the water. They do that in the spring, which is a great time to bow hunt. I mean, if you can get out there at night with a spotlight and not get shot by your neighbors, then that'd be a great time to go. And you can actually bow fish with a spotlight and get a lot of carp as they're spawning in the spring. Okay, let's see. Daniel Powell says, on the water in a small pond today, temperature was 57. Time to cut back the feeding. Yes, cut back the feeding because they're not going to be as likely to eat it. Now, in 57 degrees, bluegill will still eat. So if you're feeding bluegill, you can. Let's see here. Jason, Bob, I'll be reaching out to you soon to discuss mapping. Excellent, man. If you can gather up a bunch of data points, I'm chomping at the bit. Because what we're going to do with Jason is take that 125-acre lake and figure out what the bottom contours look at, and then start looking at a habitat improvement plan that he can do with his teammates around there. Alan Andrew Williamson, at what temperature do threadfin shad stop spawning? I'm going to tell you they stop spawning in the upper 60s. So they'll start spawning in the upper 60s. They really hit a peak when the water's in the low 70s, and they'll keep spawning in cycles of the full moon over and over and over all the way through the year. Robert Dyer, the yellow perch spawn well in sand pits with minimal vegetation. No, yellow perch will spawn well in sand pits, but they lay their eggs in long strings of what looks like gelatin. So you need to put something in there for them to stick their gelatin eggs to, or they won't spawn. Like what you can do there is you can put some artificial habitat. I'll tell you what works great, mossback fish attractors, PVC pipe. If you bought some, oh gosh, I can't think of the name of it. Somebody help me. Looks like a Sputnik satellite. If you use those, put PVC pipe in it, they'll stick their eggs on that. You need to have a row of whatever you're going to use, and those yellow perch will spawn first up in the spring typically. Torrey Roads, I have one line pond that's starting to get mucked in. What start over for a small line 2/10 of an acre pond look like? What kind of liner do you have? Is it plastic? Is it dirt? Depends on what kind of liner you got, Tori. If you've got a 2/10 of an acre pond and you've got a liner in it, you know what I'd do? I'd probably pump it dry. And if it is a plastic liner, I'd get in there. I'd get some friends to get in there, believe it or not, with wheelbarrows and shovels, and don't tear the liner if that's what you've got. Kelly Duffy checking in. Hey, we're almost done, Kelly. Glad to see you. We were talking about Rotenoning that lake as well. So early on in this show, we talked about that. Zach Russell, thanks, Bob. Last spring is actually when I started shooting them, when I could see them in the shallows. I was just wondering if maybe young carp could be hiding out upstream. But we're, no, yeah, they're going to spawn. But the good news is when the water's mucky, like what you guys have, the eggs tend to suffocate. You know, plus the fact that you've got, up there in that lake, guys, it's pretty cool. They've got white catfish. They've got black crappie. They've got yellow perch. There they call them raccoon perch. And they weren't very big. You know, and then they've got largemouth bass. So the chances of a baby carp surviving to 2 inches is pretty low. And as the bass numbers go up, you'll see a recruitment of carp go even lower. So if you can get your carp numbers down, and I do think you guys need to stock some largemouth bass in that lake. That's in my report. Then I think that'd be a good deal. Hey, Kelly, ain't no worries, man. You can go back and watch it later if you want. All right, guys. Great questions. I'm going to stick around another minute if you want to ask another one. And I don't care what the topic is or subject, hit me with it. But to tell you a little bit more about, here's a real big tip. Learn about the fish you have and how they reproduce, how they live in the water column, how they eat. Then you can further decide if you want to keep them or not keep them. Like in Jason's lake, McFadden, white catfish, they look almost like a bullhead with a forked tail, kind of a rounded forked tail. But those things will get pretty big, you know. I don't think they've got very many big ones there, but holy cow, yeah. They can get 18, 19 pounds. So they're predator fish. Those, I guarantee you, those white catfish are eating other fish. Matt Arrington, late here too. I'll watch the rest later. Good deal. Billy Bates, good stuff as always, Bob. Thanks a lot. All right, guys. Hey, subscribe to Pond Boss. $35 a year. We'll have a drawing next week. I think we're 2 drawings behind. This may be the 3rd. I'll get with Leanne and we'll do that. Pond Boss hat, Pond Boss mug. My throat's giving up, so I'm going to give up. You guys check in with us again. We'll see you next week. Adios. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.